A dramatic reversal is now unfolding in the Middle East. After weeks of escalating strikes, Israel says it is pausing its attacks on Iran, a move that comes after a burst of pressure from Washington and a fresh exchange of fire with Tehran. But the headlines that run for 30 seconds will not tell you the most important part of this story. This is not peace between Israel and Iran. It is a pause under pressure, with no sign of trust and no sign that either side believes the conflict is truly over. And the real story behind it is not the one being sold by the official statements, because the rupture that forced this halt was never between Israel and Iran. It was between Netanyahu and Donald Trump. For weeks, the real tension building in this war was not on the battlefield. It was on the phone lines between Washington and Tel Aviv. The United States and Israel have always been uneasy allies, but allies. What changed recently was that the relationship entered a phase of public cooling, a visible strain after decades of an America increasingly tired of carrying the weight of Israel's wars. And the trigger was simple. Axios says Trump told Netanyahu not to hit Iran yet. Netanyahu moved anyway. That single act of defiance is what set everything that followed in motion, and it happened in the most humiliating way possible for a US president. Days before the suspension, Trump had reportedly held a phone call with Netanyahu that did not go well. Axios reported that the call turned profane and blistering, with Trump warning he was losing patience. That is the President of the United States unloading on the Israeli Prime Minister in a private call that quickly became public. Then, despite that call, despite the explicit American request to stand down, Israeli jets took off anyway. This was not a misunderstanding. Netanyahu speaks fluent English. He understood the request perfectly. He simply chose not to obey it, and he did not ask permission. And this is where the analysis the headlines skip becomes essential. If Israel acts alone, deciding its own wars without coordinating with Washington, then a fair question follows. Why does the American taxpayer pay for the bombs? Why does the American taxpayer keep paying for the weapons, the cover, and the security umbrella if Israel insists on acting alone? Israel wants to behave like an adult when it comes to making decisions, striking whenever and wherever it chooses, but it extends its hand like a child when it comes to who pays the bill. That contradiction sat at the center of the Trump-Netanyahu rupture, and it is the contradiction Washington could no longer ignore. Part of Netanyahu's confidence comes from time. He has been in power for nearly 2 decades. He has watched American presidents come and go. Trump was president, and Netanyahu was there. Trump left, Biden arrived, and Netanyahu was still there. Trump returned, and Netanyahu was still there. A man who has outlasted that many administrations begins to believe that his own political survival outranks the interests of any single US president. That is the calculation Netanyahu appeared to make. And for a while, it worked. But it rested on the assumption that Washington would always absorb the defiance. That assumption just failed. The pressure on Netanyahu is not only external. His governing coalition depends on hardline partners who demand maximum force against everything that moves in the region. Partners who believe in an expanded Israel built through invasion and occupation. To stay in power, Netanyahu has to keep feeding that coalition. But he depends on a second coalition that matters even more. The one with the United States, the country that sends the weapons, covers Israel at the United Nations, and shields it from international pressure. When those two coalitions pull in opposite directions, Netanyahu is trapped. He chose his domestic survival over Washington's request, and Washington pushed back. What we are seeing today is not a change of heart. It is a consequence. The suspension followed a second call, one described as far less friendly than the first, which had already been hostile. According to Israeli broadcaster Channel 12, which is usually well-informed on the inner workings of power in Jerusalem, the decision was taken after direct contacts between Washington and Tel Aviv, with one specific objective: to avoid an escalation that Trump does not want and that Netanyahu kept insisting on pursuing. Whatever was negotiated or threatened behind closed doors, it was enough to bend Netanyahu, at least for now. The breakdown of trust runs deeper than one war. US media reports say American counterintelligence concern over suspected Israeli spying has risen sharply, which tells you how badly trust has frayed, even if the full scope is still murky. The claim should be treated as a report rather than established fact. When the closest ally is suspected of spying on the country that funds it, the alliance is no longer what it appears to be in public. This truce is not permanent, and everyone involved knows it. Israeli officials have already made clear that they reserve the right to attack again if they perceive an immediate threat. And for Israel, an immediate threat has historically meant whenever it decides one exists. The doctrine is preventive. The logic is that an attack can be justified before anything happens, on the argument that something was going to happen. That means the truce has invisible conditions written into every official statement, and the right to reignite the conflict is being held by every party at the table. Iran has taken the same posture from the other side, saying it will hold fire only as long as Israel does not widen the war again. Iran's position is direct. If Israel stops, Iran stops. But if Israel widens the war again, Iran says it will answer. That is not a ceasefire built on trust. It is a standoff built on mutual deterrence, where both sides are holding their fire while keeping their hand on the trigger. And the fragility was visible immediately. Even as the pause was being announced, the Lebanese front remained unstable and active, with no sign that the wider battlefield had truly gone quiet. Even as Israel signaled a halt, the northern front was anything but settled. Israel now says it may reserve the right to bomb Beirut again. Iran answers that if Israel bombs Beirut, it will fire missiles at Tel Aviv. The truce, in other words, is being announced on top of a battlefield that has not actually gone quiet. The guns paused on one front while continuing on another. For Trump, this is about more than the Middle East. He is caught between a rock and a hard place, having been defied by Israel and battered by Iran in the same stretch of weeks. What he wants now is to avoid a wider regional war that could wreck his political standing at home and expose how little control he really has. The truce buys him a moment of stability. Whether it survives contact with Netanyahu's ambitions and Iran's red lines is another question entirely. There is one more layer to watch. Netanyahu is not someone who forgets, and he is not someone who forgives. He defied Trump repeatedly through the spring and into June, and he finally hit a wall. But a man who has survived 19 years in power does not absorb a public humiliation quietly. Whatever leverage Netanyahu holds over Washington, this is the kind of moment that tends to produce a response later, on Netanyahu's timing, not Washington's. So this is the picture. Israel suspended its attacks on Iran, not because peace suddenly broke out, but because US pressure finally became too costly to ignore. The truce is with Washington, not with Tehran. Multiple reports say the halt followed tense US-Israeli contacts aimed at stopping a wider escalation. Israel reserves the right to strike again. Iran reserves the same right. Hezbollah fired during the announcement, and Trump, trapped between an ally who ignores him and an adversary who answers him, is holding a truce built on a minefield. It will hold exactly as long as everyone's restraint does, and not one day longer. Subscribe to WLA for daily geopolitical analysis.